A lot of people who get, really attacked on the internet are people who come at it with an extremely confident approach, which is I'm voicing the un-PC opinions that nobody wants to hear, and you all just want to call me names and fuck you, right? And to me, that exacerbates the problem.
Is that how you feel Jesse's behaved?
I do kind of feel that way, yeah.
Even if it's 30 people or 20 people who are horrifically murdered or raped because of prosecutorial reform, that is a cost to those policies that should be included in the debate.
You know why it's misleading to point to those costs.
Are there reforms that you favor or that Nathan favors that would undermine liberalism in the Democratic Party as opposed to strengthening it?
Yeah. Because we're principled opponents of censorship, as we've said. And, even if that... I don't think Trump should be banned from Facebook, for example. But, sure. Even though I like, not having to hear him, but I think there's a principled reason to let him speak.
I am really excited to be joined here today with two people who have, frankly, personally played a really formative role in my professional development as a journalist and politico of sorts. Nathan Robinson, founder of Current Affairs Magazine, the first person, I believe, or one of the first people to ever publish me and put me on the map. Thank you so much for joining us here today.
So nice to be back with you, Bree.
And Glenn Greenwald, one of the founders of The Intercept, another journalistic institution that has been so kind enough as to hire me, and who is now independent, Pulitzer Prize winning, plaudits up the wazoo, who's shown an enormous amount of journalistic courage and integrity. Thank you so much for joining us today from Brazil.
Yeah, I'm happy to do it. I believe this is my record-breaking, or maybe record-setting, third appearance on this podcast. So I think we agreed last time that if I came on again, I was going to have some kind of co-host rights, which I may exercise. But yeah, thanks for having me. Nathan, thank you for doing it as well.
Okay. So we're here today because Nathan recently wrote an article critiquing both you, Glenn, and Matt Taibbi, who we recently also had on the show, about what he perceives to be some kind of ideological slippage that you've displayed of late, in which, and I'll let you put it in your own terms, Nathan, but the gist of it is that there seems to be a kind of a lack of skepticism about certain right-wing arguments that have been arguably embraced by you, Glenn. Nathan, how would you frame your core disagreement with Glenn?
So I wouldn't say ideological slippage exactly. I've been an admirer of Glenn's work since I first started doing political writing. It was a big inspiration to me. And I would not say, as some people say, Glenn Greenwald has changed. I don't want to litigate that exactly. It may be just that I've noticed things that I disagree with that I didn't notice before. I'm not saying that Glenn has gone conservative, but that I have... And I tried to make this a substantive critique of a few points that I think that I see him making that I think are both wrong and frankly dangerous, and that sort of misunderstand the workings of power in the world. So, for example, I start with a discussion that he had with Glenn Beck, where he's talking about the authoritarianism of the Democratic Party. Now, I detest a lot of the Democratic Party. I'm a staunch critic of the Democratic Party. I've written books about Bill Clinton, endless stuff about Joe Biden, right? But, Glenn said to Glenn Beck that he couldn't agree more when Glenn Beck said the Democrats were fascistic for talking about the end of the filibuster, adding extra states, packing the Supreme Court. And Glenn Greenwald said that, ending the Senate is because a Democratic idea of ending the Senate is because they're a genuinely repressive and tyrannical party. Now, I think that's a complete misunderstanding of the situation, right? The Senate is the enemy of democracy. It was set up as the enemy of democracy. The idea of enfranchising Puerto Rico and D.C. and even of packing the Supreme Court is partly because the United States government is counter-majoritarian, counter-democratic, and has been that way since the beginning. I don't think these are signs of creeping authoritarianism by the Democratic Democratic Party. Frankly, the Democratic Party isn't going to abolish the Senate because, in fact, far from being authoritarian, they're mostly just ineffectual and useless. But if they did start taking these ideas seriously of getting rid of the filibuster and such, it would be a move towards democracy and not a move away from it. So, and when Glenn Greenwald said to Tucker Carlson in the advance of the 2020 election, the Democratic Party is likely to take over at least one branch of government, which is an alarming proposition because they are authoritarian. I think that actually Republican power is still more terrifying than Democratic power, and also that Republicans are stronger than they necessarily look. They're constantly trying to make themselves look weak, but in fact, they have functional veto power over pretty much any legislation, right? It's not possible to pass legislation without getting Republican agreements because of the filibuster. If you look at the state level, Republicans are trying to restrict abortion rights, deny healthcare to transgender youth, roll back voting rights, control school curricula, ban cities from imposing paid sick leave, all sorts of stuff. And Republicans try and create a narrative that the left are really in control. Now, it's a quote from Matt Taibbi, who says that all the power is on the side opposite Fox News. Glenn has not said that in particular, but he has reinforced what I think is a mistaken understanding of American politics that doesn't see, because he has said that the threat of authoritarianism, for example, didn't come at all from Donald Trump. It comes more from the Democratic Party, which he has described as fascist. I think that, obviously I don't like the way that many Democrats are, show fealty and deference to the FBI, CIA, etc., and that ought to be criticized. But I think we really need to understand it. It is very important to be clear that, to my mind, I share Noam Chomsky's opinion that Donald Trump was one of the worst criminals in human history because of his acceleration towards climate disaster, because of his firing of inspectors general, because of his refusal to accept the election result, because of immigration, labor rights, every issue you want to take. The Republican Party's agenda is absolutely terrifying. And as bad as the Democrats are, I think it is really, really important to be clear on that distinction. And I think my critique of Glenn, my fundamental critique of Glenn, is that I see a lot of stuff attacking sometimes, actual bad tendencies among liberals that I don't think recognizes just how bad that is. And in response to my critique, the things that Glenn said about me are like, the online liberal left, this is a quote, is trying desperately to show they're not like Chris Hayes. Nathan and those like him built their self-image on being radical leftists, different from their MSNBC watching parents, but now they struggle to find any differences. This is all they've got. But we don't give a shit about their dreary dogma or authoritarian culture and their captivity to the Democratic Party and are free for their repressive attempts to use in-group coercion to enforce adherence to trite liberal pieties. Now, I just think this is totally wrong. My parents would rather set themselves on fire than watch MSNBC. I am incredibly critical of the Democratic Party, and I just think that it's important to have a nuanced understanding, and I don't think that this attack on my motives really does service to what I think are substantive critiques of the positions that he's voiced.
So that was a lot. Glenn, do you have a reaction to any part of that in particular?
Yeah, I think it's a good starting point. I think that, first of all, if you listen to what Nathan said, there was a lot of kind of genuflecting to the idea that he views the Democratic Party as flawed, as doing bad things. He certainly has expressed criticisms in the past of figures like Bill and Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, Joe Biden. That's all certainly true. But if you listen to the worldview that he just laid out, it is a very pro-Democratic Party, anti-Republican Party worldview. It's something that would fit very comfortably within the confines of, say, MSNBC or CNN. They have leftists on there who, like Sam Cedar or Mehdi Hassan, whose basic worldview is what Nathan laid out, which is, look, I have my differences with the Democratic Party, but when push comes to shove, like when the rubber meets the road, you're damn right I'm going to be giving my support to the Democratic Party because they're much better and much less dangerous than the Republican Party is. I think that's the basic framework in which Nathan resides. I mean, I don't think I'm putting words in his mouth. I think that's more or less what he said explicitly. And, I think that, and that's been Noam Chomsky's basic argument that he kind of rolls out once every 4 years as well, which is obviously I'm a critic of the Democratic Party, but at the end of the day, you have to vote for them because the Republican Party is worse.
Well, Glenn, do you
think... I think there's...
Go ahead.
So let me just make a couple points, just because of how much Nathan said, and also the lengthy article that he wrote that I haven't really addressed. Although there was the article by Jonathan Cook, the former Guardian editor, that I think did a reporter that I think did a really good job of kind of isolating what he thought was driving these differences. So first of all, I do think that one of the things we have to acknowledge is that politics has changed greatly because of the Trump years. There's really no denying that. I mean, you can see, for example, that alliances have shifted. Former Bush-Cheney operatives, like the worst ones, the people who were most hated by liberals throughout the war on terror, are now MSNBC hosts. Liberals poured money into the Lincoln Project, a group run by the slimiest scumbag GOP operatives like Steve Schmidt and Rick Wilson. Neocons are now explicitly Democrats, David Frum and Bill Kristol, Jen Rubin, Max Boot. You look at, liberal media outlets like MSNBC and CNN, and they're filled with nothing but ex-CIA operatives, FBI agents, federal prosecutors. These are the heroes, the kind of North Stars and icons of the Democratic Party, which was not really true 4 years ago. 4 years ago, Bill Kristol and David Frum were still Republicans, and now they're not. They're now Democrats. And so something has obviously changed in the word work. And then beyond that, you look at polling data where the huge gap exists between Republicans and Democrats on their views of institutions that Nathan referenced, but kind of dismissively so, but that I think are at the center of American political life. Things like the CIA and the FBI, Democrats and liberals hold those institutions, those security state institutions, in much higher esteem, much higher than Republicans do. There's almost no space in Democratic Party circles for criticism of the CIA and the FBI or the NSA or the Pentagon, as we saw this weekend when, General Miley, the Joint Chiefs of Staff chairman, went before the Senate, and the only people who were criticizing him were on the right, and people on the left were kind of saying, this is outrageous. How can you criticize a war hero? I think it's not just the alliances, but the values that have shifted really a lot. So that analysis that would have applied in 2015 to whether Democrats are better than Republicans, I don't think is really quite applicable. And I think it shifted a lot of up people's perspectives, because as the political framework around you shifts, so too does your perspective. That's one thing. The other thing is, I think one of the big differences that Nathan and I have is the question of what is power. To me, the question is not that interesting. Like, is Donald Trump worse than Joe Biden? Or is Donald Trump, does he have worse views than Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi? For me, the question in politics is, who's likely to do the most damage? And I think one of the big divisions in liberal left politics is how you view Donald Trump. Did you view him as this kind of unprecedented fascistic or even Hitlerian type figure who was in this unprecedented way going to usher in fascism and posed an existential threat to American democracy? Because if the answer to that is yes, then I think it justifies a whole range of things, and not even justifies, but almost requires a whole range of views in order to combat it. You would want to fortify the FBI and the CIA and online censorship and domestic surveillance if you really believe that this political movement was about to destroy American democracy and implement actual fascism. Of course you would hug Bill Kristol and David Frum and John Brennan and Michael Hayden or whoever was on your side in battling against that. That would be rational to do. I never saw Trump that way. I see Trump as this very weak figure who never got close to even trying to, let alone being able to, overcome the enormous institutional authority that exists in the United States that's designed to preserve status quo stability. And then the last point I wanted to make is just really quickly, Bree, is when, Nathan read several quotes of mine where I'm talking about Democrats being authoritarian and fascistic and the like. And my leading examples are not things like wanting to do away with the Senate or anything like that. That was more like an example that I gave in that one interview of how Democrats will try and change any rules as long as they believe it's in their interest to do so. I don't think they're trying to get rid of the filibuster because they view it as a Jim Crow instrument. To the contrary, the Democrats also use the filibuster over and over and over and over again to prevent Republican majoritarian legislation when they were in the minority. I think they want to do DC statehood and get rid of the filibuster because it will help them now. But what I'm talking about when I talk about authoritarianism is the fact that it is the case that the Democratic Party's coalition consists of not just the CIA and the FBI and the NSA and the Pentagon, who were radically against Donald Trump and therefore on the side of the Democrats, but also Wall Street and Silicon Valley. And the most disturbing incident for me, or one of them, that kind of is illustrative of why I say the Democrats are so authoritarian, is 3 weeks before the election, when the New York Post got its hands on an archive that was from the son of the presidential frontrunner, Joe Biden, that contained a lot of personal stuff that never should have been published, but a lot of stuff that reflected on his ethics and on his business dealings in places like China and Ukraine. The Democratic Party demanded that that story be censored, and Silicon Valley monopolists joined with the Democratic Party to literally censor and make it impossible to discuss that story on the internet. You couldn't post links to the New York Post story. You couldn't post links to any other media outlet that was posting it. The same thing happened after January 6th, when Parler became the most popular app downloaded in all of the United States, and AOC and Ro Khanna went on Twitter and said, we demand that Apple and Google and Amazon, Silicon Valley monopolists, destroy Parler. And then overnight they did. So that to me is this union of state and corporate power, which is the classic definition of fascism, in order to shield Democratic Party authority from challenge. It doesn't mean I don't think there's authoritarian components to the Republican Party. It just means that I think the Democratic Party, in terms of these new coalitions that has formed in the Trump years, has become deeply authoritarian as well.
Just to interject, so I think that that's really a clear teeing up of the issues, but a few things, Glenn. I don't think, and correct me if I'm wrong, Nathan, you have defended or would come out in defense of the NSA or the FBI or any aspect of the national security apparatus, though I think you're right, Glenn, that plenty of liberals do. And I say that just because I do think there's a bit of a conflating here happening between someone who is closer to a Mehdi Hassan MSNBC host, don't disrespect Mehdi, and Nathan, who I think there's space between me and Nathan. Right. But I also don't think it's helpful
I totally agree with you. Like, I think Mehdi would also, if I asked him, say that he thinks the CIA is a pernicious presence in American life. I have no doubt that Nathan would. I don't mean to imply at all that Nathan's a defender of the FBI and the CIA, but I think that that's a lot more important of an issue than Nathan does. Like, it plays a lot bigger role in my worldview than it does in his. That's why I spend a lot more time talking about the union between security state power, Silicon Valley monopolistic power, and the Democratic Party.
Right.
And it plays a big... So I don't mean at all to suggest that Nathan is a fan of the FBI. I don't think he's Bill Kristol. I think there's huge differences ideologically between Nathan and establishment liberals. But I think that the worldview that Nathan laid out, despite those differences, nonetheless brings him to the same destination as those other people.
So I think that's a really important point, because it seems to me that throughout a lot of this, it's a matter of where we put the emphasis and what we perceive to be the biggest threat. And Glenn, what seems to motivate you a lot, and which I frankly empathize with in my own work, is that I tend to be attracted to issues that not as many people are talking about, because it feels like that's where I'm most useful. And it feels like those are areas where there's a lot more potential for overreach and abuse because people aren't watching them as closely. And I was frustrated similarly by the vote blue no matter who dynamic, and the fact that it really hinges on getting people to say and embrace the idea that Trump is worse, because that opens up a whole panoply of, like, a whole chain reaction that says, well, then if you agree that Trump is worse, you have to do this, that, and the other. And what that does is obscure other paths, other strategic avenues that one could go down if you didn't have that kind of absolutist framework. So Nathan, I wonder how you feel about the idea that the difference might be not substantive in many respects, but about this question of emphasis and whether it's necessary for someone to constantly emphasize that Trump does present some kind of threat in order to be credibly heard on other kinds of threats that exist.
Emphasis is actually an important description of I think, core difference between Glenn and myself, because one of the reasons that I see, and again, that Chomsky saw Trump as the greatest criminal in human history, is because if your emphasis is on climate, if it's on labor rights, which Trump just shredded, if it's on the rights of immigrants, if it's on workplace safety, then, Trump is obviously completely monstrous, and it's important to do a lot to stop him. Now, I don't accept, and it's often heard, and this was in Jonathan Cook's article too, this idea that if you think Donald Trump is one of the worst criminals in human history, it justifies doing anything to stop him. Now, the reason that it doesn't is precisely because we can see what the consequences of letting that justify almost anything would be, right? If you say, Trump is such a huge threat, thus we can do anything, including censorship, including mass murder, right? Where do you stop? And then you lose all of your principled commitments. So I think but I mean, again, and I share with Chomsky the belief that you can hold these two beliefs at the same time, which is that you don't have to downplay the very serious threat that Trump poses on all these issues that matter a lot to me. I understand why they are sort of, I don't want to say that Glenn cares about them less, but that, your focus has always been on a lot to do with surveillance, censorship, free speech, and such. But if that is your main focus, then it is understandable that for someone whose main focus is, for example, the fact that the West of the United States is about to be completely on fire, or the fact that buildings are collapsing in a deregulatory culture, right? We would have a very different view of what matters. I mean, I look at state legislatures and I see them currently trying to basically reshape school curricula for political reasons. That really, really deeply alarms me. So in some ways, we do just have a different focus, and that different focus gives us sort of leads to a different assessment of how serious, in fact, the threat is.
Yeah, so just on that, a couple of things I think, because it gets to like one of the nubs of the different ways of looking at this. So Bree, I think what you said was very perceptive and also very important. I'm glad you brought that up because I do want to emphasize that. It is true. Like when I started writing about politics, remember I didn't have a media platform, right? I just created a blog. And the reason I did that was because I thought there were things that were being ignored or overlooked that deserved attention. Not because I thought those issues were the most important issues. I was writing about Article 2 theories of executive power and the NSA scandal that broke when the New York Times reported that there was spying going on domestically without warrants. It didn't mean that I thought that was a more important issue than, say, income inequality or criminal justice, overly punitive criminal justice, things I ultimately did write about. I was writing about those things because I felt like that's where I could make an impact. That's where I could make a difference, because that was the stuff that nobody else was talking about. So when I go to it's funny, I saw some video today that I did where I did a Democracy Now! Segment that somebody had posted about Russiagate, and there was like 3 minutes of me saying that all the reasons why I thought Trump was this incredible menace, this grave threat to the functionality of a healthy democracy, why he was incredibly corrupt, things that I've said over and over and over and over again. I mean, obviously I'm not a fan of Donald Trump's ideology, nor of his governance, but I look at the media world around me and I see that pretty much everyone outside of like right-wing news outlets are waking up every day and doing nothing but saying over and over how Trump is this enormous threat. People are writing best-selling books about it. Republicans are saying it and becoming heroes of the liberal media. NBC, ABC, CBS, the New York Times op-ed page, the Washington Post op-ed page, the papers themselves are all dominated by that similar theme. So when I think about how I can best use my platform, I don't think about, well, let me go ahead and just echo what everyone else is already saying, because I don't think there's a lot of value in that. There may be value to me. My career would probably thrive more kind of seamlessly and effortlessly. I'd be less disliked or more well-liked if I were to do that. But in terms of the impact, I just don't think that would make a lot of impact. There's all this stuff about Trump being the gravest danger was being said by everybody, from like all those Republicans we just got done talking about to, Nancy Pelosi and Rachel Maddow, to Noam Chomsky and Nathan Robinson. That there was hardly like a need for me to be screaming from the rooftops about Trump's evil. And so instead, what I focused on were the things that I thought were being done to the Democratic Party in response to Trump that were incredibly dangerous, that were being overlooked, like really serious forms of authoritarianism, a revitalization of neocon ideology, and the FBI and the CIA as really dangerous institutions interfering in our democracy. So that's one thing. The other thing is, I find it a little bit odd, this like sudden, or in Chomsky's case, not sudden at all, like this almost monomaniacal focus on climate as the reason that Trump, has to stand out as this grave evil. And I just had an email exchange with Chomsky where he defended that position by citing that argument again. Because the reality is that for 4 years, nobody was talking about climate. Nobody was talking about climate. Overwhelmingly, the threat that Trump posed, according to most media outlets, was Russia, was the fact that he was blackmailed by Russia, that he was controlled by Russia. And a big part of my split with the left, or liberalism, became that I just didn't think that that was a real scandal from an evidentiary point of view. Like, I just didn't think it was true that he was in bed with the Russians, that he had colluded with the Russians, that he was being controlled by the Russians. And I also thought it was an incredibly dangerous thing. So and one of my arguments all the time about Russiagate was all the stuff that Nathan just said about deregulating the economy. Part of the problem was all of that stuff was being drowned out because everybody was talking about Russia instead.
I agree that Russiagate was all a bunch of bullshit. This is the problem, and I think one of my critiques of the approach you take here is to say, well, everyone's criticizing Trump all the time, therefore we're going to go in a different direction and examine the Democrats. But what you and I both know is that the criticisms that were being made of Donald Trump were frequently the totally wrong criticisms. As you said, nobody was talking about climate. Noam Chomsky was he's been talking about climate the whole time and saying like that is the reason Trump is such a serious threat. This Russia bullshit. So yes, there's all this anti-Trump stuff, but it was totally unpersuasive, right? Trump came very close to winning re-election, and he did that in spite of the fact that, as you would point out, these news networks that nobody watches or cares about, MSNBC, CNN, right, are going like, Trump is a terrible threat, he's a terrible threat, but then the arguments they give are completely unpersuasive. So the approach that I've taken, and that I think Chomsky takes and is correct, is to say, no, what we need, I wrote a whole article called Bad Ways to Criticize Trump, and one of the reasons I did a whole book about Trump, Anatomy of a Monstrosity, is that I believed that all of the anti-Trump stuff was totally ineffectual because it was not getting at the real sources of why the Trump's Republican agenda was such a serious threat.
But why do you think that is, Nathan? Why do you think that is? That if the Democrats care so much about climate and immigration and income inequality, they spend all their time talking about Russia instead of those things?
Because most of them don't care about anything.
I agree. Exactly. Exactly. I agree totally. They don't give a shit about those things. No. Which is why, exactly. So, look, I think those things are dangers. Those things that you just described. We probably have differences on how dangerous they are and whatever, and how to best deal with them, and the like. But I also think, and this is, I guess, what has frustrated me a lot about this kind of discourse over the last 4 years is, even if you think Trump is dangerous, like, Trump is one power center in the United States. He's not, I don't even think he's close to the most powerful, even when he was president. But even if you want to say he was, there's tons of other power centers that were pushing it back against him all the time and were doing very dangerous things as well, often in the name of undermining him. And that's what was getting so little attention. And in a lot of ways, American liberalism didn't just start ignoring that, but applauding it. Things like online censorship and greater power in the hands of the FBI to track people they regard as domestic extremists, and joining with Wall Street and Silicon Valley. You say Trump almost won despite networks that nobody watches. It wasn't just despite that. It was Wall Street and Silicon Valley overwhelmingly funded the Democratic Party. Almost all institutional power was behind defeating Trump because they perceived him as this kind of unpredictable, unstable force. And so, I think that there were a lot of dangerous things being undertaken by this very powerful coalition aligned against Trump that was receiving way too little attention. And even with Trump gone, still is receiving too little attention.
But Nathan, I don't think he would disagree with any of that. Would you, Nathan?
No, although I would say that I think some of it is a little illusory. Like, I think a lot of opposition to Trump was discursive rather than substantive, and that ultimately, like, Trump was very, very good for the business community, right? Very few of them actually. They might detest him as like putting a very vulgar face on American capitalism, but he gave them their tax breaks. Right. So they may say they dislike him, but not much. There's actually not much done to undermine him. But other than that, a lot of those critiques, I certainly agree with. Right, I got censored by The Guardian when I tried to write about Hunter Biden, so I know this firsthand.
That's why it seems to me that the issue isn't, and I don't. The issue does seem to be about this proportionality point, because I know, since I've had you as an editor, Nathan, I think that's something that you do that's very skillful, that makes it so that a lot of your arguments are heard by folks who might otherwise not hear them, is to put in a lot of caveats when you know you're going down a spicy road. So I remember writing, I think the first thing I ever wrote for Current Affairs, my article on identity politics, and the first 3 paragraphs are me talking about what identity is, why identity is relevant, what is and isn't identity politics, why it's important for people to be able to make political arguments on the basis of their historically marginalized groups. All of that kind of stuff before I dig into my critique of the weaponization of identity politics. And I think that gives a lot of people who might otherwise not listen to me, or who thinks that, a critique of identity politics is just a right-winger who doesn't like to acknowledge the existence of race or racism, it lays the foundation for them to trust me. And what it feels like sometimes is that trust, when it comes to Glenn, has been lost. And I think that some of that is unfair, because people accuse anyone who is critical of the Democratic Party as being a Trumper and yada, yada, yada. But I think that there is part of it, Glenn, that is potentially valid, because whether or not you feel like you should have to build in some of those caveats, it would help you if you did. And moreover, there are these moments, Nathan, you wrote about this one exchange that Glenn Greenwald had with Glenn Beck, where Glenn Beck trots out a bunch of, I think, unfair criticisms of Democrats, one of which was the Senate, which I would agree with you on substance, Nathan, is an anti-democratic body. And then Glenn Greenwald, in your response, you didn't really acknowledge the substance of what Beck had said. You just said, I agree. And then you levied your own criticisms of the Democratic Party, right? So it wasn't that you agree. I don't think you actually substantively agreed with Beck in the exchange. You didn't pick up on any of the things that he has specifically talked about. But in effect, listening to it, you end up tacitly condoning all of his criticisms in total. And I think that is something that is of concern if you go on news sites like Fox News, which I completely support and have no issue with. But if you don't at the same time push back against those aspects of the arguments that are made there that you don't actually agree with, because then you just look like you end up co-signing.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's interesting. You were talking, I think there's different stuff. We all have different styles, right? That make us be able to have an impact, be able to be heard in this enormous, almost infinite media ecosystem, right? There's a reason why Current Affairs has its fans. There's a reason why Bree has a big online following. There's a reason why I've been able to have a large readership and be heard for a long time. And there's no one right way stylistically of doing that. Some people are just more kind of conciliatory in their debating or speaking style, and that's effective for them. And other people are just more kind of combative and aggressive, and that works as well. And a lot of that is just, what our personality traits are. I do think a lot of this though is about what our role is and how we conceive of it. I never really saw myself as being, certainly not kind of a spokesperson for the Democratic Party, but even beyond that, I never saw myself as being in captivity to a particular ideological dogma. The only label I've ever really been comfortable with accepting for myself is civil libertarian, because it's kind of a narrow set of views and principles and values that I'm very comfortable accepting. So one of the things that, I do think a lot about is I'm only interested in doing this work, and it is work, right? Like we're here on a Saturday, we're in front of our computers, we're talking about politics, it's going to get promoted online, it's going to generate work, we're going to have to talk about it. I'm only interested in that if it can actually have like an impact on the world, if it can actually make the world a different place than it would be without that. And so the way that, politics can be done, which is like, okay, I'm in this camp, I identify more with liberals or the left than I do with the right, and therefore I'm going to kind of defend the left, defend liberalism. That is a way of doing politics, but I ultimately find that way to be kind of ineffective. Like I feel like it doesn't change a lot. It's what I probably did more than not for the first 5 or 6 or 7 years of my work, but that kind of, I'm going to be on the left, I'm going to criticize Democrats. At the end of the day, I'm going to vote Democrat. I just feel like that's not getting anywhere.
But I'm with you on that, Glenn. I'm 100% in your camp on that part. But it's the part where you can end up... Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, so like what I've been doing a lot more of is looking for ways that people who think that they're irreconcilably apart and even adversarial can actually recognize similarities that they are taught not to see. And so going into right-wing venues and speaking to them like in a respectful way about their worldview and making them open to the things that I say is a really valuable opportunity for me, because I can put in front of them things that they would not otherwise be open to. And so it's, there are times when I go on Fox and someone says something and I will object to the premise of the question. But usually what I'm doing in those cases is looking for ways to say, these are things that even though you see yourself on the right as agreeing with, and even though this person on the left sees themselves on the left, we actually have these similarities in common that we can come together and work towards, because that's the only kind of politics at this point that I think can really make a difference and that interests me. And so maybe you're right that I'm not as like confrontational when I'm in right-wing venues by saying, oh, you said this and this is totally false. But I think it's because my mindset is looking for bridges to build and not burn. Yeah. And I don't think if like someone says something and you don't respond, like Nathan has said a bunch of stuff that I haven't responded to just because, I've deprioritized it. Same with him. It means I'm condoning it. I just think you have to have like an objective when you're communicating, and that objective will drive the choices you make about what you do address and what you don't.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And I think it's another one of those, is we're back to emphasis, because Nathan, for you in the current affairs, I remember I wrote a piece way back when about how to talk to Trump voters. Should we talk to Trump voters? And I raised as an example the man whose name I always forget. I'm so sorry. But a black guy who talks to all these Klan members and ends up talking them out of being in the Klan and has like 17 robes in his closet or whatever each, for every man that he's convinced not to be a Klan member anymore. And his approach is not to go in swinging and disagree with what everybody says immediately and be like, racism is wrong, you're a bigot. He sits down, he has a Coke with them, he talks about their kids, and I'm sure things are said that he would object to, he would have every reason and right to object to, and maybe even an obligation, some would say, to object to. But he lets them slide because he's trying to establish a relationship. Do you think that is a fair approach for Glenn to be taking? And if so, is it maybe... would your answer differ whether or not he's having that as a private conversation versus on Fox News with Tucker Carlson in front of a lot of people who might perceive that kind of interaction differently than a private interaction?
So that guy who goes and meets with Klan members and develops relationships with them, it's kind of an incredible project. But one of the notable things about what he does is that he goes in there with a sense of mission. His mission is to exorcise their racism. Now, I believe strongly that leftists ought to go on Fox News. I've written a whole article about the way that leftists have successfully sort of jiu-jitsued Fox News. Katie Halper did a wonderful appearance, Elizabeth Brunig, Adam Gaffney has done excellent work going on Fox and defending left positions. So I wouldn't ever criticize Glenn for the act of going on Fox. I would say, however, that I think he may be a little naive about Fox News, because one of the things he has said is that he believes that his getting invited on Fox a lot shows that there's kind of a political realignment. But when I look through all the Fox News headlines, it's Glenn Greenwald rips liberals with no scientific training. Glenn Greenwald rips MSNBC's Joy Reid. Glenn Greenwald rips former Intercept colleagues. Glenn Greenwald rips Brian Stelter. And, Fox News, of course they want you on for that.
But Nathan, though, just to be clear, those are foxnews.com articles that are like write-ups of my tweets, they're not my appearances on Fox.
But when you go on Fox, have you challenged Tucker Carlson over his white nationalism?
No, it's not. No,
right.
I mean, I did
so
one.
they will have you on until such time as you do something to embarrass them.
Well, first of all, I have gone on Fox before. I run a Laura Ingraham show and, talked about how Fox News disseminates its own levels of disinformation, similar to what MSNBC and CNN does is at the beginning of her show. And she said, if you ever see me doing that, let me know, and I will immediately correct it. A month later, she said some false statements about Omar Mateen's wife, who is currently on trial unjustly for collaborating in the Pulse shooting. I called her out and said, what you said is false. She went on air that night and retracted it. When I had Tucker on Jeremy's podcast, we spent at least half the podcast with me confronting Tucker on all the ways that I think he's being racially inflammatory. But again, it's like, I'll give you an example. Like most of the time when I go on Fox, what am I doing? I'm criticizing the CIA. I'm criticizing the FBI. I'm criticizing the security state or the NSA. I'm also criticizing CNN and MSNBC and the media coverage of liberal outlets and their reliance on security state, propaganda in order to do it. And I do think that's important to put in front of right-wing audiences, to get right-wing audiences conditioned to hearing that the CIA and the FBI are deceitful institutions who are there to interfere in American political life to subvert the democratic will. Or like on my Substack page, every single time I talk about the dangers of this new war on terror, every time I link it to the abuses and excesses of the first war on terror and what was done to American Muslims. I've been able to interview, Mohamedou Slahi, who was the Guantanamo detainee who was imprisoned for 15 years in Guantanamo without due process. I was able to interview Yasser Lawadi, a Muslim French civil liberties activist, about the Islamophobia from Emmanuel Macron, and put it in front of my very heterodox audience, including a lot of right-wing readers who now are receptive to hearing about that because it's presented in a way that ties it to their worldview in a respectful way. And it is much harder work than if I were to just be talking to a liberal audience applauding everything I was saying. But I just think it's more valuable work. And if you want to say look, you sometimes err on the side of being too kind of conciliatory. There are certain things that you should challenge that you don't challenge. I'm sure I make those kind of mistakes. It's actually a difficult balancing act to do, to not pretend that you're one thing, to continue to uphold your values, but at the same time, do it in the Lion's Den in a way that you're not like the clown who's there to fight with the host, but you're trying to build bridges to that sector of American political life so that they're in general open to what you're saying because they respect and trust the fact that you're telling the truth. It is a hard project, and I don't claim to be perfect with it, but that is.
I think 90% of that. Yeah, I agree with a lot of that, and I actually don't want this to be kind of the source of our disagreement here, because I think that Bernie went on Fox, and I think that a lot of the stuff about there's that awful you're the new darling of right wing media, and it's well, I think you have to critique the substantive positions that people are advancing rather than the venues in which they advance them. Current affairs, we try and make left arguments to I like to think a non-left audience a lot of the time. I think converting people is a really, really important part of what you do. You can't ignore those you disagree with. So I think we share most of what you said, and I think my critique probably would be along those lines of, there are areas, especially when I was watching Glenn Beck, it was that in fact you agreed with him when he said they're trying to get rid of the filibuster, they're trying to expand the Supreme Court, they're trying to enfranchise Puerto Rico and DC because they're a fascist party, and your response was, I couldn't agree more. And I think that is the point at which you have to say.
But Nathan, let me ask you that. The Democrat, do you think that the reason the Democrats are in favor of DC statehood and eliminating the filibuster of the Electoral College is because they believe on principle that those are anti-democratic policies, or because it just so happens to be that DC voters are overwhelmingly Democrat, and right now the filibuster is impeding their legislation, and getting rid of those things or changing those things would further entrench their power?
But the important point to make there is to say that those policies are democratically necessary. Those are not inherently bad policies. Now, you could say, this for opportunistic reasons by some people. I think some people are genuinely committed to democracy. I'm not completely cynical. I think that a lot of the effort to expand voting rights is because people believe in voting rights. And I think that when you're confronted with a right-winger like Glenn Beck, the important thing is to say, no, we have to get rid of the filibuster. We have to give DC statehood. That's something that we should do because it is the right thing. And we could critique the Democratic Party separate from that, instead of saying, well, I couldn't agree more with what I think is actually kind of a delusional analysis.
What do you think about that,
Well,
Glenn?
I mean, I think, I think, what I think is that the Democrats are interested in changing whatever rules they can change, with one metric only driving what they want to change, which is how to further entrench Democratic Party politics. I have zero doubt, that if the District of Columbia were filled with Republican voters overwhelmingly, Mitch McConnell would be waving the flag of democracy to demand DC statehood, and Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi would be alluding to the design of the founders about how important it was to keep the Capitol neutral and not part of any state. They would be on completely opposite sides. So my agreement with Glenn Beck was about the fact that the Democrats are willing to use authoritarian measures, including censorship, including getting into bed with Silicon Valley, including using the FBI and the CIA for political purposes, including changing the longstanding rules of government institutions.
But changing the rules isn't authoritarian. That's not authoritarian. No, that's good.
It is. It depends. First of all, it depends what the motive is. And then I will say, this is, I do think this is a big difference that I have with parts of the left as well, which is I don't think that pure majoritarianism is a positive political value. I think it's incredibly tyrannical.
This is just a small fraction of a 2.5-hour epic conversation that we had with Nathan Robinson and Glenn Greenwald. You can listen to the rest of the conversation exclusively by subscribing to Bad Faith Patreon for $5 a month. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. Look forward to seeing you over there.